Alien leader visits human military academy, leaves in shock. The moment that changed everything. They called humanity young. They called them reckless. They called them weak. For centuries, the great empires of the galaxy looked down on Earth's people, believing them to be an anomaly. A species with too much aggression, too much chaos, and too little wisdom. Supreme Commander Zelvok of the VA Curie Dominion believed this too, until the day he saw what humans truly were. He had visited hundreds of military academies across the galaxy. He had watched the finest warriors of 100 species train for battle. He thought he understood war. He thought he understood strength. But nothing prepared him for what he saw at West Point Lunar, the most elite military academy on Earth. He expected strategy and discipline. What he saw was something else entirely. A brutal, unrelenting force that defied logic. He watched soldiers endure pain that would cripple most species. He saw warriors that should have collapsed push themselves even further. He witnessed men and women fight as if death itself was not an option. And for the first time in his life, he felt fear. Because what he saw in that academy was not training. It was forging. It was the creation of something the galaxy had never seen before. A species that did not retreat. A species that did not surrender. A species that refused to lose. Before going forward, please subscribe to HFY Aliens Battle, because this is the story of the day an alien commander learned the truth. Humanity was not weak. They were the most dangerous species in the universe. The arrival, a visit to Earth's stronghold. The VA Curie Dominion had ruled the stars for thousands of years. Supreme Commander Zelvok had personally overseen the training of warriors across the most advanced academies in the galaxy. He had witnessed the finest soldiers from the most dominant species. He had seen warriors born into strength. He had seen soldiers engineered for war. And yet, as his diplomatic shuttle descended onto the surface of West Point Lunar, something felt different. At first, it was subtle, a simple unease. Perhaps it was the design of the facility, built like a fortress, not an academy. Perhaps it was the silence, no idle chatter, no wasted movement, only precision. Or perhaps it was the eyes of the humans watching him. Their expressions were not hostile, but they were not welcoming either. Zelvok had been greeted on 100 worlds, each species eager to prove their discipline, their tactics, their efficiency. But these humans? They did not seem concerned with proving anything, because they had nothing to prove. They knew what they were, and they knew what he was. Weak. The thought unsettled him. No one had ever made him feel weak before. His escort, a high-ranking human officer named Colonel Briggs, walked beside him. The man was older, his uniform pristine, his presence unshakable. "This is our academy," Briggs said, leading him through reinforced corridors. "The best of the best train here." Zelvok nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "I have visited many academies, Colonel. I look forward to seeing what yours has to offer." Briggs smirked. "Oh, I think you'll find it educational." They stepped onto an observation deck, overlooking an open training field. Below, human soldiers were engaged in drills. At first glance, it seemed normal. Marching formations, tactical exercises, live-fire weapons training. But then Zelvok looked closer, and that's when he realized something was very, very wrong. The conditions were brutal. The soldiers carried weights that should have shattered their bones. The heat was cranked to lethal levels, yet none of them collapsed. The course they ran was designed to break lesser beings. And yet, not a single human stopped. Not one. No hesitation. No weakness. Only persistence. His mind struggled to rationalize what he was seeing. In every other military academy he had visited, there were limits. Here, there were none. And suddenly, a terrifying thought crept into his mind. This is just a training. What are they like when they fight for real? The first observations, when strength becomes fear. Zelvok had seen elite warriors train before. He had seen VA carry commandos, their bodies engineered for speed and precision. He had seen Titan-born mercenaries, towering giants bred for war. He had seen Choric shock troopers, who felt no pain and never retreated. And yet, as he watched the humans train, a realization took root in his mind. These soldiers were not the strongest. They were not the fastest. They were not genetically enhanced. But they were something far more dangerous. They refused to break. He watched as a human cadet collapsed from exhaustion. The trainers did not step in to help. Instead, they stood over him, watching. The cadet, shaking, gasping, on the verge of collapse, forced himself back up. Zelvok narrowed his eyes. Most species, when exhausted, reached a point where the body simply refused to move. But humans ignored that point. Their bodies should have failed, but they pushed forward anyway. He turned to Colonel Briggs. Your cadet was clearly at his limit. Why not allow him to rest? Briggs didn't even look at him. He simply nodded toward the training field. Zelvok followed his gaze. The same cadet had now surpassed his previous pace. A moment ago, he had been on the verge of collapse. Now, he was running faster, as if pain was nothing but an obstacle to be ignored. Something twisted in Zelvok's chest, a feeling he had never experienced before. Unease. He watched the cadet finish the course, body shaking, limbs nearly giving out. And then, instead of resting, he lined up to run it again. Briggs turned to him, his voice calm. That's why we don't stop them. Zelvok had studied human physiology before. He had read about their endurance, their ability to withstand pain, their stubborn refusal to surrender. But reading about it and witnessing it were two very different things. This wasn't just training. This was conditioning. The humans were breaking themselves down so that when war came, nothing could break them. Zelvok had come expecting to see an inferior species. Now, for the first time, he was beginning to doubt, because what he saw in these humans was not normal. It was something terrifying, something that defied reason. And he had the growing, sinking feeling that he had underestimated them. The combat demonstration, violence perfected. Zelvok had seen enough. At least he thought he had. He had seen their brutal endurance training. He had seen them push past physical limits that should have broken them. And yet, he still clung to the belief that perhaps, just perhaps, their actual combat skills were lacking. Because in the end, endurance meant nothing if one could not fight. That belief shattered within moments. Next, we'll be running a live combat test, Colonel Briggs announced, leading Zelvok toward a large viewing platform overlooking an enclosed training arena. Zelvok studied the facility, reinforced walls, combat droids, live weapons. Not simulation gear. Real weapons. His brow furrowed. Your cadets use actual weapons against each other. Briggs shrugged. There's no point in training if they're not facing real danger. Zelvok said nothing. This was madness. In the Dominion's military academies, cadets trained with simulated combat. Realistic, yes, but never lethal. Soldiers were too valuable to risk dying in training. Apparently, humanity saw things differently. The alarm sounded, and the arena's doors hissed open. 10 cadets entered the battlefield, clad in combat gear, their faces set with an unsettling calm. Their opponents? Automated war droids. Faster, stronger, and programmed with precision combat tactics. The match began, and in an instant, Zelvok understood. Humans did not fight like soldiers. They fought like monsters. He had seen warriors fight with discipline, with control, with careful, measured movements. Humans did not fight that way. They moved like they had nothing to lose. One cadet rolled under incoming fire, rising to shoot an enemy point-blank in the face. Another used a fallen comrade's body as a shield before counterattacking. A third had already been shot 3 times, and yet they continued fighting as if the wounds were inconsequential. Their strikes were not calculated, not rehearsed. They were relentless. Zelvok watched, his hands gripping the railing. It wasn't just their skill. It wasn't just their coordination. It was the way they fought. There was no hesitation, no fear. They did not fight to win. They fought to end their enemies. The match ended in less than 2 minutes. The war droids, torn apart. The humans, bleeding, bruised, but still standing. Still ready for more. Zelvok exhaled slowly, his mind racing. He had studied humans as a species of conflict, of aggression, of war. But he had not truly understood what that meant. Now he did. These are not just warriors. These were weapons. And suddenly, for the first time, he realized the unspoken truth. The other empires feared humanity, not because of their technology, not because of their numbers, but because if you go to war with them, you do not get to stop fighting. Not until they decide it's over. And if they do not decide, then you lose. The mindset of a soldier, a lesson in fear. Zelvok had seen enough, or so he thought. He had watched humans endure brutal conditions. He had watched them push past their limits. He had watched them fight without mercy. And yet, the most terrifying revelation had not come from their bodies. It came from their minds. These cadets, Zelvok said, turning to Colonel Briggs, they are trained beyond anything I have ever witnessed. But why? Why take it this far? Briggs gave a small smile, as if the question amused him. You think this is excessive? Zelvok gestured toward the battlefield below. This is not training. This is breaking them. Briggs nodded. Exactly. Zelvok frowned. Then why? Why break your own people? Briggs finally turned to him, his voice calm, steady, and cold. Because the universe will not show them mercy. So he won't either. Zelvok felt something deep in his chest. A slow, creeping unease that no amount of logic could dismiss. He had met warrior species before. He had met genetically modified super soldiers. But this was different. Other species fought wars because they had to. Humans fought wars because they refused to lose. And that was something else entirely. Briggs led him through the halls, past rows of cadets tending to their injuries in silence. No complaints, no self-pity, only readiness. Zelvok had always believed that war was won by strategy, numbers, and firepower. But here, in this academy, he realized the truth. War is won by the species that refuses to stop fighting. And that species was humanity. He had come expecting tactics and discipline. He had found monsters in human skin. And the worst part? They were still getting stronger. The final test, facing the impossible. Zelvok had witnessed things that defied logic. He had seen human cadets endure conditions that should have killed them. He had watched them fight with no hesitation, no self-preservation, only the will to destroy their enemies. And yet, Colonel Briggs was not finished. There's one final test you should see, the human officer said, leading him toward a reinforced chamber, a containment zone, a place where even human soldiers feared to enter. The doors hissed open, and Zelvok stepped inside. The air was thick, hot, charged with an almost unnatural tension. Inside, 5 cadets stood in a single line, their faces unreadable. Briggs nodded to the instructor. Run it. A panel lit up. A warning alarm sounded. And then, the room changed. Zelvok barely had time to react before the chamber was thrown into chaos. The gravity shifted, quadrupling in force, pressing down on the soldiers like a crushing weight. The temperature spiked, suddenly freezing, then scorching hot. Blinding lights flashed. Ear-shattering noise filled the air. And then the floor collapsed. Steel barriers rose, dividing the cadets. The walls closed in, forcing them into tighter and tighter spaces. And the final test began. The first cadet's chamber filled with toxic gas. The second was hit with high-voltage electrical currents. The third was subjected to direct neural stimulation of pain receptors. The fourth was given a simple task: press a button to escape, but doing so would result in the execution of another cadet. The fifth? Total sensory deprivation. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15. None of them broke. Zelvok's hands clenched. This was not training. This was a nightmare. Any other species would have collapsed. Any other species would have begged for mercy. Any other species would have failed. But not humans. When the test finally ended, when the barriers lowered and the cadets stumbled out, they did not collapse. They did not scream. They simply stood, shaking, bleeding, alive, waiting for the next command. Zelvok took a slow step back, something tightening in his chest. These were not warriors. They were something else, something the galaxy was not ready for. And in that moment, he realized humanity was not preparing for war. They were preparing to win it. The departure, the galaxy forever changed. Zelvok sat in silence aboard his diplomatic shuttle, staring out at the void of space as Earth grew smaller in the distance. He should have been relieved to leave. Instead, he felt something he had never experienced before: dread. The great empires of the galaxy had always viewed humanity as an anomaly. A young species. A reckless species. A species with too much fire, too much aggression, too little control. But now he understood the truth. They had all been wrong. Humanity was not reckless. They were not undisciplined. They were deliberate. Everything they did, every brutal training exercise, every moment of suffering they inflicted on themselves, it had a purpose. They were not training to survive. They were training to become something unstoppable. He thought back to the cadets, their blank faces as they endured what should have broken them. He thought of the combat drills, the ruthless precision, the sheer refusal to accept defeat. And he realized something else. This was only their academy. These were not their elite. These are not their best soldiers. If this was what their cadets were capable of, then what were their true warriors like? A cold chill ran through him. The galaxy had always dismissed humanity as an unpredictable, violent race. But now, Zelvok knew the real reason why the great empires feared them. Because when humanity went to war, they did not do so for conquest. They did not do so for dominance. They did so to finish it. And when they fought, they did not stop until their enemies were dust. The galaxy was not ready for them. And when the day came that humanity truly unleashed itself, nothing would be able to stop them. Zelvok exhaled, closing his eyes. He had come to Earth expecting to judge humanity. Instead, he had left with a warning. Do not go to war with them, because if you do, you will not survive it.